Welcome to this screencast of the origins of the Cold War, primarily for IB students doing high-level history, but also useful for anybody studying the Cold War and trying to get a sense of its origins. This is going to be the first in a series of short videos. You can see here the different areas that can be covered in this unit, going all the way from Yalta and Potsdam right through to the end of the Cold War. There's always going to be a recommended film, just as a starting point. 13 Days with Kevin Costner is a good way to start, and you can see the icons there. They refer to different activities if you're going to use this as a teaching resource. Just a bit of a background, now's a great time to study this area. One reason is the Russians are starting to open up some of their historical accounts. By their own admission, some of their history wasn't as accurate as it could have been. US documents are becoming more and more available as some of the vaults are opened and some of the more information is being declassified. These sources give great material for us to analyze and look at. And some of the agendas of the writers of history can now be critically reviewed with some of this new information. So it's a really interesting time to study. It's really important coming from I'm coming from a Western perspective here, but it's really important that we challenge that. We're looking at ideologies, obviously the two, communism and capitalism, especially. It's really, really important that we challenge what we perceive to be our normal state of mind with these. Like from a Western perspective, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that communism was wrong or didn't have the same advantages, but we have to always look at both sides of the story and create a balanced perspective. The Cold War itself, what does it mean? It typically refers to the relations between East and West, not necessarily US and Soviet relations. It's important to realize that it really is East-West. Okay, when we're looking at the Cold War itself, it took place in many different theaters around the world, and it's really key that we know that actually no war took place between the two countries, USA and the Soviet Union. Proxy wars were the main feature. A proxy war, as you can see here, is a war started by one of the major powers who then do not directly participate. So we look at Vietnam, we look at Korea, we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, we look at all these different theaters, and actually it's either one or the other. The USA or the USSR are directly involved, but not both. When could you argue that the Cold War began? 1917, is that reasonable? The reason that's up there is because that is when in the Russian revolutions and the Bolsheviks take control in Russia. So you could argue that communism took its roots then, and then maybe the difference in ideology started at that point. So, certainly Britain was fearful of what was going on, and many Western nations become their monarchies. So it could reasonably be argued that maybe there was some tension existing there. In terms of ideology, if you don't understand the difference between communism and capitalism, now is a good time to look at that. It's very important before we move on that you do know those things, and having a good look at what communism was like in Russia versus what Karl Marx set out to be. Is you need to know that. Also, obviously, the USA, USSR, and the UK were allies during World War II. Changed really quickly in 1945, so we have to challenge ourselves with that question. And the reasons it changed are relatively simple. They were allies by a common enemy rather than genuine friendship in the Second World War. So the reasons it changed so quickly is because they didn't have anything common to fight against, if you like. But if we look at these kind of reasons, the explosion of the atomic bomb in 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 by the USA was looked at by Russia and USSR as like a kind of a big statement to say who has the most power. Remember, we're looking at a balance of power shift after the Second World War. Things have changed. The old European empires are starting to diminish, and these new superpowers are starting to emerge. And it became clear quite early on that USA had greater technology than the USSR, and it scared the USSR. So obviously they pursued their own nuclear capability. As I just mentioned, it's the end of the great power status. Germany and Japan have finished. Japan, who had been building up its kind of reputation in the world and its military impact around the world. That had diminished with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and obviously the ultimate surrender. And Great Britain and France are declining powers. Their European empires are dwindling now. And really, the two superpowers emerge. They're the only ones really with the ability to wage any kind of war, if you like. And so they're the two you focus on in this Cold War battle. And because the ideologies are so different, tension was bound to arise. Just some of the learning objectives here of the kind of things you want to get through. And really looking at the Cold War is what factors were the most important in terms of raising tension. The world in 1945 is a very different place to what it was in 1939 when the Second World War started. Decolonisation was a very real issue for European powers. They were starting to back out of their colonies around the world. Mainly it was costing too much money and they weren't making enough profit from them, so they upped and left them to get on with it themselves. But it was a pointer to those European powers really not being the force they were. The ideology that would shape these relinquished colonies was a factor. It certainly dominated the push for communism and also the drive to prevent it. So those European countries, when they left their colonies, who was going to replace them and what ideology would that be? This idea of capitalism versus communism mixed with European powers losing control and trying to cling on to power really created this interesting environment around the world. And there's a bit of a let's wait and see what's going to happen and which power is going to take control quickest. Okay, as the Second World War came to an end and before the official start of the Cold War, numerous attempts were made to fill the obvious power vacuum which would be left by both Japan and Germany. Most notable was the Atlantic Charter. It was in August 1941. It was a joint declaration in 1941 from the UK and USA to pursue a world free from totalitarianism, and as they are supposed allies with Stalin at this point, pursuing a world free of totalitarianism is a direct criticism of Stalin, I would argue. So interesting that as an ally, you see early on that they're not really that good friends. The Land-Lease is the financial assistance for military aid from the USA to the UK and USSR to help end the war. And Roosevelt's 4 policemen was suggested to USA, UK, USSR, and China to shape the post-war world. So you can already start to see who are going to be the powerhouses. We've already talked about this, but the USSR, USA, UK were allies in World War II because mainly they needed each other and it was convenient. And why Russia and France were allies in World War I, same reason, kind of like a relationship of convenience. That didn't continue when they didn't need each other. They were very different and wanted different things. What we're going to look at now is the 3 men that dominated kind of like the vision of the post-war, and as the Second World War was coming to a close, Winston Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin came together, and they were really going to be the people that were going to discuss what happens next. Churchill was leading a declining power, and he really wanted restoration of the balance of power. He wanted the British Empire to be strong again. He felt that Britain had stood alone against Germany at the start of the Second World War and felt that Britain needed her place in the sun, if you like. Roosevelt had joined the war late after Pearl Harbor. His main concern was actually in Asia and Japan. And Stalin felt that due to the huge losses they had sustained, it deserved compensation in Europe. And to be fair, you could argue that it was Russia who'd actually ended Germany's kind of waging of war in the world, and it was them that pushed them back. We're going to look quickly at the Yalta Conference, a very significant event. It happened in February 1945, also known as the Crimea Conference. The war's not over. The Allies, though, are assured of victory. You can see here Churchill and Stalin surrounding the US leader there, Roosevelt. And the arguments that were brought to the table at Yalta were these. The unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. They were going to divide Germany into 4 zones. And this is a proposed idea from these leaders. These zones to be occupied and administered by Britain, France, USA, and USSR. Elections to be held in the countries of Eastern Europe. A League of Nations, which was ineffective, were to form a United Nations to keep peace after the war. The government of Poland would be both communist and non-communist, and Russia would declare a war on Japan and help the USA after Germany had surrendered. So this was the picture in the Yalta Conference, that these three very strong, very experienced, and very dominant leaders and statesmen came to agree on. What happened next? Stalin clearly never held free elections in Poland. That's no surprise. Roosevelt unfortunately died 2 months later. Truman, who was the next president, would attend the next post-war conference at Potsdam. Hitler dies on April the 30th, and Germany surrenders on May the 2nd, 1945. Things change very rapidly, and the picture looks very different from when the three leaders came around the table. Winston Churchill, the Soviet Union has become a danger to the free world, sets out his stall quite clearly, and he wrote this to Roosevelt after the Yalta Conference. He was very clear about how he felt about the Soviet Union and really what he felt about communism. But unfortunately for him, he had lost power in Britain. And the leaders of the three countries would meet one more time in Potsdam. So, in July 1945, they meet again in Potsdam to discuss what is actually going to happen. Truman has replaced FDR. Truman claims no idea of USA foreign policy at this point. He claims that he was unaware of the plans for the atomic bomb. He did give the authorization to drop it, but he claims that he was unaware of the plans of it. Churchill is voted out of office by Clement Attlee, a Labour politician. He was very much interested in social welfare and rebuilding Britain at home, and wasn't an experienced, maybe, leader on foreign, or even cared about foreign affairs. He just wanted Britain back on its feet. Stalin remains the strongest of the three leaders at this point, the most experienced, the most dominant, intent in seeking reparations as much as they can get from Germany, and is the only leader left from Yalta. He used this to his advantage. So what did they agree on? They certainly agreed on Germany being split into 4 zones. You can see here the 4 zones: UK, France, USA to the west, and Russia to get eastern Germany. And you can see that Berlin as the capital remains within the Soviet zone, and it would be split up in exactly the same way as Germany. So the capital would be split up into the 4 zones, but would be surrounded by the Soviet Union's influence. So a very tricky place, Berlin, and it becomes almost the center of the Cold War. The disagreements at Potsdam, they certainly couldn't agree on how to divide Germany. It's a lot of very valuable land in Germany, and it's interesting to know how that would be divided. They wouldn't agree on the amount of reparations Germany should pay, and they couldn't agree on Soviet policy in Eastern Europe, and that would last for a long time. Germany became the center of tension in the Cold War, and this is a really important point. Right in the middle of Europe, split right down the middle, you can see the tension between the West and the East, and if you go into Berlin, it's a microcosm of that, and you can literally see the vast differences between West and East. So we have a line that's drawn right in the middle of Europe, and a very scary line, considering the weapons that both sides have. 2 blocks effectively emerge, and in March the 5th, 1946, Churchill gives this very famous Iron Curtain speech. He attacks the Soviet Union for exerting its will over the countries of Eastern Europe and said that Europe was now divided into totalitarian and free Europe. He continued to say it was a duty of free countries to prevent the further spread of communism into Western Europe. This actually proved to be the first shot of the Cold War. Stalin could quite rightly judge Churchill to be a hypocrite. Churchill wanted the rebuilding of the British Empire, which some would argue did exactly what Stalin was doing and occupying free countries for its own gain, but that would be a different story. These 2 blocks became known as the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, and that is the end of that. Thanks for listening. More next.